Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Micah's Mentions. Today I'm going to be discussing some books that I read in January, and hopefully you'll hear something that you might be interested in. What I'm going to be doing for this video is that I'm going to be breaking down what I liked and what I didn't really like about each book, and also give specific criticisms in things that I'm trying to improve on myself, namely being that of prose. Um, there's one or two books on this list I read a lot in January. I surprised myself. There's one or two books, probably just the one, that kind of felt weird with its prose, and I'm, trying to work through that myself. So that's the first bit of housekeeping that I need to get through. Second thing is that I am working on getting a better webcam, so hopefully in the future I will have better quality videos coming up soon. I already use a pretty good microphone to record all this. That's why the sound quality doesn't sound awful. So hopefully we can get through that. So gonna start off. Gonna start off with my least favorite from January, and that is Final Girls by Riley Sager or Sager. I don't know. You'll be hearing that name a lot on this video. Uh, so about this book, I really wanted to like it because I had already read another book by Riley that I thought was very engaging, very entertaining, and I thought was fun to read. This one also had the same kind of, it was fun to read, but I couldn't connect to its characters. It was kind of a thing where the main character and the questionable character on the whole, is she, isn't she, situation that's going on throughout this book, I couldn't connect to them as characters because they just didn't really interest me. Um, as a result, side characters that were only there for little bits and pieces, they also didn't really stand out because they had one specific personality trait, and that's really all we get with them. Um, Ultimately, my biggest issue with this book is its main character goes back and forth a lot on whether or not she chooses to believe um, what's going on throughout the story. And as we get to the end of the book, it's just. Although I will say, I greatly enjoyed the ending. I felt that it was probably the best part of the book, especially when we finally got the full of what happened at the Pine Cottage. And that was fun. I liked having all those big narrative reveals happen. I was even wrong about the whole situation. So I will admit, like, some stories can still surprise me to this day because I kind of swore myself off of mysteries and mystery thrillers because of this issue that I was predicting who the killer was. And this book kind of took me off guard. There were a lot of twists that happened at the end of the book. Not all of them I felt worked, but for the most part, the ending is the best part of this book. I do want to make a mention that if you yourself cannot read anything that has the kind of vibe of sexual assault, this book will not be for you. I recommend other things instead in place of this. I haven't read it personally, but I have looked into the Final Girl support group. I don't know if it's that good as a replacement for this one, but this is probably not a book I would be coming back to. Um, but I would still recommend it if you are interested in the concept of what comes next for that of a Final Girl surviving a slasher movie. So if you're interested in that, check out Final Girls by Riley Sager. Next up is another Riley Sager. We have Survive the Night. And this is one that I've seen a lot of people talking about, especially on the book side of YouTube. I saw a lot of people saying it's in their worst list of 2021, and while I thought that its whole premise was a bit incredulous, it was pretty entertaining to me. Like, if nothing else, this is a very entertaining book, and it's a very fast read. Once the pacing gets going, it gets going. And I found myself a bit invested with the main two characters. They're very enjoyable to me, despite the fact that one of them is more or less manipulating the other throughout the entirety of the book. I felt that their chemistry was pretty good. As a whole, the writing is, well, for the most part, it's pretty standard fare. There's nothing too extreme. There's no big grammatical errors. There were some points where I was questioning the usage of specific words, but it's not like as a whole it was that bad. So it was kind of one of those when I saw it on people's list for the worst of 2021. I was like, I'm pretty sure I've seen people say worse books from last year. Um, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because the entire setup for this story is something that nowadays would never happen. Even back then in the early 90s, I doubt this would be much of a thing that would happen where somebody would do a ride share thing with a complete stranger in the middle of the night. Like, that's already a big yikes. Um, Another issue that I have with the entire setup is that it relies on you accepting that Charlie's decision here is fair, which I understand where she's coming from, and I understand that it was a very big traumatic thing that happened to her, that happened to all of those affected. I don't want to give much of any spoilers here. I'm sorry. So I'm going to be pretty vague, like vague city here. Um, as a whole, I understand why Riley decided to do this change. I just feel like it would have been in her best interest to wait along with um, the rest of the night. But at the same time, if she hadn't done that, and the rest of the story wouldn't have concluded in a way, and it probably wouldn't have ended up nearly as well fulfilling for the university and the story. You'd understand why if you read it. I found the ending to be pretty good. I not gonna lie, I got a little bit of misty eyed near the end with certain things here and there. The big reveal at the end over who the killer is, I felt was done in a way that was good enough, but it also is pretty predictable. I think this is one of my biggest issues with certain Riley Sager books is that we have a very small cast and it's kind of easy to figure that out. Um, I mean, with Final Girls, I said that I couldn't figure it out, but I had narrowed it down to one or two people. But again, that's just because it has such a small cast. I feel like if both of these books had a little bit of a larger cast, we probably would have more questions on who it could be, and we wouldn't be getting to this reveal and being like, well, I kind of figured that. Um, as a whole, that kind of writing could be figured out a little more, especially since this is, I mean, this isn't a long book, actually. This is just a little over 300 pages, maybe about 324-ish, but it's, in my opinion, it's quick. Some people were saying it was slow, but it also depends on if you're willing to accept Riley's decision here for Charlie very early on. If you can't get behind that, and you can't get behind the characters and their entire plight, then I'm pretty sure this will be a very, well, it won't be a fun read. Survive the Night, again, I would recommend it as a whole, but if you're probably not going to be the person that is willing to accept the premise as a bit out there, then you probably wouldn't enjoy this book. So that's why it's number 2 on this list of 6. Next up is White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson. I was very excited for this one because R.L. Stine is a favorite from me. I grew up reading Goosebumps, and when I got to be a teenager, I evolved into Fear Street books. So when I saw that he had made his own comment saying it's creepy, frightening, I wanted to scream, I was like, oh, I'll give this a look because I don't see his name very often on things. It could also help that I don't immediately look for what authors are saying about other books. I've never read a book by Jackson in the past. This was my first by her. But I will say, I'm kind of a fan. I felt that this was a pretty good book. The first half was a lot of setup, and I felt like the character of Piper was a bit too creepy kid to be accepted in the first half. But the second half is where the book really takes off, and I love that for it. Especially since it's not a long book, it's sitting at 374 pages, and I'm honestly a big fan of how she wrote her prose. I love the main character in this book. Mary was great, or Mari, um, Marigold. So I'll just say Mary for the rest of the this section. I really liked Mary. She was a very entertaining character. I fully got invested in her story, and I loved her by the time every single big reveal came about. Um, and I felt like this is probably the most upset I got by the end of a book from this entire pile, because I understood what was being stated here by Jackson with the social commentary, and I enjoyed that. If you're not a fan of books or media with social commentary, I would say skip this one. But if you are willing to engage with that kind of narrative, I totally recommend this book. It's great, it's thrilling, and by the end of the book, you're probably going to be similar to me about how it's frustrating that this is all happening the way it's happening, big city, and wishing that it could be a little bit different, but it's not. And I do wish there was maybe like 3 or 4 more chapters at the end so we can get a bit more resolution for our characters, because where it ends, it feels like there was more planned, but we just never got it. But as a whole, I strongly recommend White Smoke. From this book to number 1, I would just strongly recommend all of them. Once again, that is White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson. Next up is an author that originally I didn't want to read any book by him. Now I have all of his physical copies. Funny how that kind of happens sometimes. Originally, I'm going to preface this one. Originally, I was going to avoid his works entirely because I had watched a review for another book that I have sitting on the shelf back there. And she mentioned one of his other books that's to be read. I don't know if I'm ready for that just yet. And I really didn't like what I was hearing, so I just kind of tuned out the rest of this man's stuff. But then I started getting a bit curious, and I picked up my first copy from the author Nick Cutter, and this book is Little Heaven. So this book takes place in both 1965/66 as well as the year 1980. Although we get a lot less of 1980 as we do compared to 1965 and 1966. And I felt that this was a well-paced book. It's very long. It's the longest one of this entire section. It's 486 pages. But I really liked all 3 of our main characters by the end of the book. I loved all of them. I didn't want anything bad to happen to them. And I was like, fingers crossed, really hoping, because I kind of figured that books by Nick Cutter wouldn't be happy endings. And for most part, I'm right. However, I'll get to that in a bit. This is probably the most tense I've been when I was reading a book. This comes with specific illustrations in it at certain points that help punctuate exactly what's going on in the scene, so you can get the feel for what the characters are going through. And certain pictures that are included here would, well, get me demonetized. And I'm like, just starting out, bro. So like, why would I want to risk getting demonetized? Little Heaven is probably what I would connect to the most with Nick Cutter's books, although I have specific connections to all 3 of his more well-known books. With The Troop, I was in a Boy Scout troop when I was younger. With The Deep, I personally suffer from thalassophobia, so I have a connection there, so that would be a bit chilling. And Little Heaven is that it's an evangelist group, and I have ties to that through my family. So, reading through Little Heaven, I gotta say, there were certain parts where I was questioning exactly how they would be loyal, but after thinking about my own life, it's like, no, I kind of believe that. Um, I love the sarcasm of our three main characters because they're constantly going through this entire situation with all the skepticism in the world. And by the time that the weird things start to happen inside the camp, because something weird already happens prior to them getting into the camp, as soon as they get inside the camp and the weird things start happening there, they're already suspicious of everything and everyone. And I feel like no matter what they did, it would have ended the same way. And that's probably the tragic part of this entire situation, is that it would have played out the same way. It was just, I feel like them showing up was the catalyst. It was what ultimately caused this entire situation to blow up as it did. What I liked most about this book is the interactions between Micah, Minerva, and Ebenezer. I felt like they all had great chemistry together, and I, for the most part, really enjoyed the prose. It gets kind of gross in this book, I'm not gonna lie. There are specific parts that I would not recommend to anyone to read unless you're really into reading horror. Nick Cutter books are not what I would recommend because they're pretty graphic in multiple fronts. Specifically, every single one of his books has harm come to animals, and if that is not something you like reading about in the slightest, avoid. Um, but my biggest issue with this book are Micah. Although I like his character, the way he talks throughout this book, I had to constantly completely change how he was talking. So I would change things from like cannot to can't, because there were just full on phrases that's like no human being would talk like this. So I would always shorten the words or change how he's saying it as I'm reading it, because it would be like this roadblock and I would stop where I was reading because I needed to make sure that I read what he said correctly. Everybody else talked normal. It was just Micah that had the issue. So I had to change that, and I didn't really enjoy reading that. However, the rest of the book was very enjoyable, except for the ending. I felt like you could have chopped off the second half of the epilogue. We didn't really need to have that insinuation of what exactly this thing is, or what is helping feed it, because it's not really necessary. Like, we can figure that out from how the 1965-66 ending goes. So as a whole, that part I felt was rather unnecessary, and I would have chopped it off myself if I was editing the book. So that is Little Heaven by Nick Cutter. Next up is the last Riley Sager book in number 2. After them being like the lowest of this list to now second place. And we have Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. The same horror book reviewer that I watched that recommended me one of the books back here, I was also recommended this book. So let's talk about it. Home Before Dark is about Maggie Holt coming back to this manor that her parents had bought years prior, and they left in the middle of the night one time, claiming that it was drastically haunted, and Maggie's father ended up writing a book about it that became the bane of this town's existence. And it's funny that I say bane, because I'm pretty sure the name of this hall is, Baneberry. So what's very interesting about this book is the character of Maggie, because throughout her life she's had to live with the popularity of her father's book, and as a result, her entire life has been riddled with lies, because she figured out very early on in her life that a majority of the book isn't true. So what we have throughout this book is that of Maggie's story going back to Baneberry as an adult, as well as her father's story that he wrote as they left, going back and forth. So we have these big reveals that make sense as we're reading it, and then we get to the ending where all the twists start happening, and it worked. All of it really worked, and I was really surprised by that. I was kind of worried that we were gonna hit the ending, and it's just like, oh, that's it. I'm not really a big fan of that. But then we had yet another twist come along, and it's like, whoop, okay, I'll keep my mouth shut. um, as a whole, I didn't really have much issues with this book. It was very fast paced. I read this in like 3-4 days, which is very fast for me. I really liked all the characters. They were very entertaining, and honestly, most of the reactions that happen in this book are very human. Like, they're realistic reactions that I would believe. So when we get to the end and we have all these big twists happening, it's like, well, how's this gonna end? And then we get to that ending, and it's very cathartic. As a whole, I would strongly recommend this book. It's my favorite by Riley Sager so far. I know that Riley has another book coming out this summer, and I'm very much looking forward to picking it up. So, Home Before Dark. It's a haunted house book with a twist. And if you're interested in figuring out what that twist is, pick up a copy yourself. There should be things you can buy at your local bookstore. I would more rather recommend buying local than Amazon, but if you don't have a choice, go ahead. Conveniency is there. So Home Before Dark, strongly recommend. And for the final book on this list, we have another Nick Cutter book, and that is The Deep. As I had mentioned earlier, I have thalassophobia, so I was a bit worried going into this book that I was going to have issues with that flaring up. I'm glad to say, no, that didn't really happen. However, this is a very intense book. It's a page turner, and throughout the entirety of it, I was constantly having this feeling of dread. Like, the atmosphere in this book is palpable. If nothing else, this is atmospheric. This is, kind of similar to the thing that I was talking about earlier, but this is not a mystery thriller, so it's allowed to have a smaller cast. We only have 4 people throughout the majority of this book. We have Al, we have Luke, we have Clayton, and we have this other doctor who is not in it for very long. And it's just a majority of this book is just one thing after another. It is very exhausting if you're not ready for that. Because as soon as we get down into this underwater lab that Luke is called to, it's just, well, things have already been starting. So you just get to join in on the mayhem the second that you arrive. And that just makes it fun, because that means the pacing is going to be fast. Some people that I've talked to that have expressed their own issues with this would be that the pacing was a bit weird to them. I didn't feel that. A majority of the people were arguing that all the flashbacks and memory sequences that we had throughout the book made it a bit to them. I thought that kind of helped me, honestly, because if nothing else, I was very much feeling the same kind of thing that Luke was feeling throughout the entire book, of just paranoia and just this unrelenting stress building up, because, like, is this a dream that's happening? Is this a dream? Is this real? I don't know. So we have a lot of questions of that throughout the book, and it gets very interesting on whether or not you can figure out what's a dream, what's a memory, and what's really happening. And if that interests you, then you should definitely go pick up a copy anywhere that you can. I was able to track down a used ex-library hardback, which I normally try to read hardback myself. It's just better time for me, but I wouldn't recommend it for everybody. Again, this is Nick Cutter, so there is animal harm in this book. And I would also warn that there is a bit of fat phobia if that's something that is troublesome to you. Um, I will end off this section by reading out probably one of my favorite bits from the book. Um, and that would be, let's see. All right. I will not be giving any spoilers as to who this is directed to, but this is probably my favorite section of prose from this book. And this is honestly the book that inspired me to start writing myself. Um, his body bloated with seawater, the skin hanging off his bones like hunks of wet wool, his face torn apart by searing metal, squelching towards on his water-rotted feet, leaving plops of pulpy, black flesh in his wake, lisping, "You did this to me. You did this." And if that doesn't interest you to figure out what exactly is going on in that sequence, who that's directed to, I don't know what to tell you. It just wouldn't be the book for you. I think my biggest criticism is the ending because the entirety of the book is balls to the wall insanity. So when you get to the end of the book, it just doesn't measure up as much as I wish it would. So by the time we get to the last few pages, it's just like, well, I wish that we had gotten a little more of this, and we just don't really get that resolution. And if you're wanting a book that answers all of its questions, this is not going to be the book for you, because we follow a character that is very mentally vulnerable because of his past relationships, and as a result, the ending of this book is going to be very different from how you would probably want it to be. So if that's not something that you're really wanting in a book, I would say to avoid this one. So there you have it. That's the 6 books that I read in January. My books that I read in February is going to be a lot shorter because I had specific issues that I'll bring up when I have that video. Hope that you really enjoyed this one. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And hopefully I'll be back with more of these videos, longer videos about what I read in the future. And hopefully my webcam will be a lot better in days to come. Thanks for watching.